The title for this panel, I have selected it together with Fabiano, coordinator of the panels, because we believe that this is high time to pose questions about UV protection, which was a sort of embedded optional in the world of optics. So something which has already been heard of and which is probably no longer a matter of debate also with final users. But as a matter of fact, UV is still a very important topic. If we think of cosmetic products, they are investing a lot in research and development to develop UV protection products. And the latest statistics of the Italian Ministry for Healthcare confirm that skin cancer is still very common. So we shouldn't really lower our protection. We need to find a new way of discussing. We are still back to the old concepts we had with a statement of intentions made at a time when UV was in the foreground for debate and was also a topic for selling optical products. I'm very glad to have so many panelists today and a large audience. We have an ophthalmologist, a physicist, an opticist, an expert of communication, and two technical managers of very large companies. Two major players investing in research and also in education. So, on my right-hand side, Dr. Maurizio Martino, our physicist, university professor at Lecce. Head of department in optometry, then Sergio Scalinci, the ophthalmologist in this panel, who will give us information, and after him Giancarlo Montani, on my left-hand side, whom you all know. He is an educator and also an expert. On my right-hand side, we have people from the industry. Mr. Brianti from Zeiss. We would like to give them a round of applause because they have supported us. They travel a lot, they work a lot, and they are very open to discuss. And then Mr. Gioia, another acknowledged member of educational bodies. You know, companies are crucial for training younger generations and also for training, for refreshing older colleagues. There's an old way of saying, if you stop learning, then you stop growing. Let me just introduce Professor Martino, who will be talking about physics. Good morning. I'm very happy to see so many of you at lunchtime. I'm Professor Maurizio Martino, head of the faculty of Salento. I will give you some physical indications about UV light and the possible effects when UV light interacts with matter in general. I'm here referring to polymers referring to lenses, But not only, I will then hand over to Professor Scalinci. We will also talk about the interaction between UV light and biological matters. I work in the field of biotechnologies, so we use UV lasers. Therefore, when we talk about safety and interaction with UV light, we have to be aware of certain well-established and well-identified mechanisms. Here we see the spectrum of electromagnetic waves. Back to basics. These are probably some familiar concepts that are worth recapping. Electromagnetic waves carry information and energy, and they come from different sources. As you can see here in this slide, we have visible light, which is just a small portion. On the right-hand side, we have ultraviolet waves. On the opposite end, we have infrared waves. Today, we will be discussing about UV light. UV sources. They are very common, much more than you might expect, from halogen lamps to other light sources. For instance, also the small readers for banknotes. There are different UV sources that are a part of our everyday life. Also in laboratories and in everyday life, we can find UV light sources. What are the damages arising from UV exposure? We have non-stochastic damages that are directly correlated to UV exposure. We are talking here about the protection from light. Intense exposure causes direct damage to sensitive parts like the skin, the eyes, and other body systems. Then we have longer-term or stochastic damage, where exposure is prolonged at low doses. UV light is very rich in energy, doesn't have much penetration because it's quickly absorbed, so that energy is released in the more superficial layers of matter, which is the primary source of UV light, the sun, of course. And therefore, we should first focus on that. This is a solar spectrum. You can see how the light components interact. We have the various layers of the atmosphere and how UV light reaches our bodies. In the central part of the spectrum, we have green. This is the reason why our eyes have got used to this green light, and our vision has evolved around this specific wavelength. We have no specific vision in the ultraviolet spectrum here. UV light, the smallest part of energy that we receive irradiated from the sun, but this is also the one which has got the most energy, the most harmful one, which interacts very deeply with physical matter. Professor Scalinci will then explore the interaction between UV light and the DNA. And also the eyes, of course, are affected by UV light. And we need to start thinking what could be the devices to protect our eyes from UV light? So there are several variables driving the intensity of the UV light which reaches us. First of all, the height and the latitude of the sun. I come from southern Italy, from Lecce, Puglia. The latitude of Lecce is important. Then we have ozone depletion to consider. Ozone is a natural filter protecting us from exposure to UV light on the Earth's surface. And then, to a minor extent, we have another source of UV light due to the reflection of the objects surrounding us. Here you see a table with the various wavelengths and the classifications which have been developed in ISO for UV light. 400 nanometers, visible light is usually considered between 400 and 700 nanometers. So this is the typical wavelength. And as you go down, you have other classes of UV light. You have probably already heard about UVA, B, and C, and there are also some examples of interaction on the right-hand side. We can measure UV light in terms of energy or wavelength. There is a relationship between the energy and the frequency of electromagnetic waves, or we can also measure the whole using wavelengths. There is a correlation, of course, between the two. This gives you an idea of the energy content of UV light. And this is a fundamental aspect of the energy content of UV light. This can cause breakage of bonds in polymers or in biological materials. To describe the danger arising from UV light, an index has been developed conveying the damage which can arise from exposure to UV light. I don't know whether you are familiar with it. Recently, in the weather forecasts, at the end, you see this UV index, most of all in summer, to show you the areas where you are more exposed to UV light. This classification has been subdivided into 14 levels. At our latitudes, we use just 11 levels. And this measures how dangerous UV light can be at a specific day, at a specific time of the day. The higher the value, the higher the value and the incidence of UV light degradation. This is another fundamental element to consider. UV light reaches physical matter, so there are degradation phenomena which take place in polymers, for instance, CR39 or other polymeric materials that are present in optical lenses. Polymers and photodegradation triggered by exposure to UV light at a wavelength between 300 and 400 nanometers. This is just to give you an idea. We are talking about CC chemical bonds that are affected by exposure to electromagnetic energy-rich waves. And what happens here is absorption of energy, which is then carried along a polymer chain until there's breakage. Here you see an example of how the various wavelengths interact with different materials. Each material has got its own specific features and its mode of interaction with UV light. And of course, there are activation thresholds for all of them. This is the level of energy in kilojoule per mole. It's the quantity of energy which is necessary to degrade, to break chemical bonds, which are nevertheless present in all polymers. Very quickly, before I hand over to Professor Scalinci, you see a scheme of how the eyes interact differently with the various wavelengths. Today we will focus on interaction with UV light, which is not always harmful. Think of laser surgery in the UV spectrum, excimer laser, to correct, for instance, or to remodel ocular surfaces, corneal surfaces. Here you see another interesting scheme describing interaction and how this is related to exposure time. When we talk about the sun, we talk about low intensity and longer time. If you have, on the contrary, higher intensity and short exposure time, and this is the case with laser, then we will have completely different phenomena. Biological tissues. Very quickly, let me just give you some ideas of what can happen before I hand over to Mr. Scalinci. Thank you very much indeed.
Grazie Martino.
Thank you so much, Martino. I have a question for you. Climate change, can it affect? Will it affect? Will it affect the tables you have shown us? Can something be changed because something is happening at the level of climate? For sure, something is changing, but according to the latest news is that the ozone hole is closing. We're getting into the infrared segment. Climate change acts on the greenhouse effect and in turn on infrared radiation. So we have UV, infrared, heat, and I believe that climate change will have an effect, especially in terms of infrared radiation. That's the greenhouse effect. In the case of UV, not much should change, no. I'd like to give the floor to the ophthalmologist, Dr. Scalinci, for a short but interesting speech. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Optic Club organization and specifically Mr. Fabiano for the invitation extended. And let's start immediately with the first slide. We know that the general population is aware of the consequences stemming from excessive exposure to UV light, and Dr. Martino explained the various phases, and just 7% of people associate UV light to the onset of eye diseases. Let's go on. So, the risk of eye disease as a result of UV was described, and we do hope that the ozone depletion will reverse, because the ozone depletion gave rise, obviously, to such variables, and especially, as was said by Professor Martino, it depends on the location, seasonality, and hours of the day. Don't forget that today, in order to get suntanned, we go to the beach from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And I say to the youth in that segment, you should avoid exposing to the sun. So the thinning of the ozone, what does it cause? You have an increase in UV light, and you have such UVB rays that reach us. Obviously, if they reach the Earth, as was said by Professor Martino, also the altitude and latitude change, and if UV light increases when latitude decreases, so equatorial areas reach the highest exposure. Other sources, for example, longer hour, lead to a cumulative effect and hence a disease for the eye. Let's now analyze what happens when a photon of radiating energy impacts the eye. First of all, you should know that when the photon impacts the eye, you have a mechanical effect. Mechanical effect that is translated into a temperature increase at the level of the retina, with its consequences, phototransduction. The UVB light at 300 nanometers is approximately 600 times more biologically effective in damaging eye tissue than a UVA light at 300 nanometers. And the cornea and the lens are the main tissues that absorb UV light. But fortunately, we also have certain anatomical enzymatic conditions that allow us to defend ourselves against UV light. The eye is such that such structures defend the other tissues underneath. Cornea represents a projection tissue, and the lens as well, and our phototransducer is the retina, and below 300 nanometers UVB, the cornea absorbs most of the radiation, while the lens absorbs basically UVA rays. So the UVA radiation doesn't damage DNA just as it happens for UVB, but it can generate chemical intermediate products, just like oxygen and hydroxyl, that can damage DNA itself. The UVB radiation causes damage to DNA, forming anomalous proteins that lead to cell death. So, as I said before, mechanical effect, thermal effect, and photochemical effect. These are the three events that happen when a photon impacts our eye. Let's see what happens in terms of the disease. At the level of the conjunctiva, it is damaged by ultraviolet radiation, and it activates a set of oxidative reactions and cell death. And just like when we analyze something serious, tumors, and it can cause squamous cell carcinomas that start from the corneous limbus. And another disease that is quite common in subjects that are exposed to UV is represented by pterygium. Pterygium starts from the conjunctiva and can involve the cornea, and it can cause visual problems, severe visual problems, and especially it affects those subjects that stay outdoors, that don't wear UV sunglasses, and all workers that work outdoors, please do wear protection. So, a weaker link has been found in the case of so-called pinguecula, and in this case we don't know to what extent the sun or snowy areas can have an impact. In the case of the cornea, the situation is more complex because corneal tissue is impacted by photons at first, and the corneal epithelium and endothelium absorb UVB light especially. What happens? Photoprotective bonds are broken in the corneal tissue. Absorption is at the level of the stroma, and in some cases where you have keratoconus, or in cases when you have refractive surgery, you may have the possibility, such trials are underway, that radiation can reach the lens more rapidly, and it is not yet well known if stromal thinning can bring about damage and lead to cataract. Cataract, it's a pathological condition that is fortunately more simple, connected to a sporadic event. It's snow reflex blindness characterized by a feeling of blepharospasm, especially when you are in a snowy environment, when you go to the mountains. And this is connected to non-protection against UV. The corneal epithelium and Bowman layer absorb UVB radiation 2 times more than in the case of the corneal epithelium. Photokeratitis, described as an alteration, a transient alteration, it affects especially corneal epithelium. 1 hour exposure to UV light reflected by the snow, or an exposure of 6-8 hours to sand reflected light can cause a threshold photokeratitis. In such conditions can lead to corneal ulcers, abrasions. At a lower level, you can just have a discomfort of the lacrimal film, and it just affects the superficial epithelial tissue. Chronic exposure to UV environmental light is considered as a significant factor in the development of droplet climatic keratopathy or sphenoidal degeneration. You have a droplet lesion in the surface stroma. In terms of protection, as I said, you already have enzymatic substances that help us be protected. We said that the highest protection is given by the cornea and aqueous humor to then protect the retina. That's why the ozone depletion is causing us problems, and you have a higher frequency of cataract in 50-year-old people than in the past. So my suggestion is to get vitamin C, because vitamin C is an antioxidant for the lens. When you stay in sunny environments, in that period you should get vitamin C. Vitamin C tarred, not the usual 500 milligrams, C-tarred vitamin C, because normal vitamin C is toxic, so choose the right type of vitamin C. And those subjects that suffer from cataract, you have trials showing that ascorbic acid, vitamin C, is slightly less and inferior than at the level of aqueous humor. So the lens, we know it, the lens can lose transparency in the course of years. And so aging, it can be something inherited, but exposure to UV light, and it was proven also in animal models. And there's a connection between cataract formation and exposure to UV light. The lens, as you know, the lens absorbs UVA and UVB light with different mechanisms of action, and hence cataract. You have enzymes, and if you go beyond a certain threshold, you get to the retina. You have such mechanisms, and also melanin. Clear eyes should be more protected against radiation. You should use more protection than in the case of dark eyes that contain more melanin. So the retina, apart from intrinsic mechanisms connected to antioxidant systems and macular pigments, retina should be protected against UV light, and the lens plays its own important role in avoiding so-called macular degeneration, senile macular degeneration. So, as I said before, when you stay outdoors with so much light from 11:10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So conclusions. We should reiterate the importance of wearing protection against UV light from early age. So our children should use protection, and just like contact lens holders, and despite contact lenses already protect their eyes, they should protect themselves against UV light with special filters. And now Professor Montani will speak about it, and vision professionals have the duty to communicate how to protect yourselves, avoiding eye damage. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Scalinci. You've been a good doctor. Also because students were writing down notes. The only problem is that they go to the beach at 11 a.m. because in the evening they go to the disco. And I invite older people, apart from getting cholesterol examinations, they should have vitamin C examination, and we should invite our physicians to consider such factors because it's so important. A very brief question. Before, you spoke about a low number of physicians that devote attention to eye problems. Where's the weakest element of the chain? I would say schools, because we should teach students about the importance of protecting eyes, primary schools, and then also educating colleagues and opticians so that we can have mass screening, and so that companies themselves can carry out new research and identify new types of protections. I'd like to start from primary schools, yes, from the basics. Then we shall see how our friends from Zeiss and Hoya will reply. And I'd like to give the floor at this point to Giancarlo Montani. And an applause. The only Italian to speak at Las Vegas, and also others.
Chi di più lo dice, insomma, in questo senso qua.
We are very honored to have him here today. He's optometrical specialist and also a great communicator. The very first thing I would like to tell you is that you have probably invited us because of our latitude. So we are all as panelists from southern Italy. That's probably the reason for inviting us to take part in this workshop. This is just by way of introduction. And then cooperation. You have been talking about cooperation, and we are considering the same problem from different perspectives. When we talk about vision, there are possible shades of color, possible connotations, and of course different backgrounds. Physicists will dwell upon physical technicalities, and then we have clinicians who practice as ophthalmologists, and then there are technologists who sometimes act as a trade union, as a bridging link. Talking about health and healthcare, we also have to analyze the UV light and how we react to UV light exposure and clear the way from biases. We have heard about wavelength. Professor Martino has explained how wavelength works, but there are also other things that are not so easily defined. So we have very important regulatory bodies. We would expect to get useful and univocal information from them. We have ISO or CIE, and sometimes it's difficult for them to set a boundary between blue light and UV light. And I am a bit surprised here. Then, talking about the effects, to trigger effects, UV light needs to be absorbed. When we talk about absorption, we talk about a contact with matter. And then we have the so-called cumulative effect. We have facts that do not develop immediately. It takes 2 hours to develop photokeratitis after exposure to a snowy surface irradiated by strong light. In the case of sand, it takes longer. It takes 6 to 8 hours. So there is a prolonged effect. It's exceeding a certain threshold over time, which causes an effect. So we can expose ourselves to light, and after prolonged exposure there will be an effect or a damage arising from it. We can talk about anterior and posterior surfaces. We have a natural diaphragm, an energy regulator, our pupils. We have a pupillar size and also pupillar pigments. Darker eyes are more protected. Lighter eyes will be less protected. And then we should also consider radiation, which induces a change in pupillar diameter. Pupils are sensitive to 480 nanometers. 400 is the peak value stimulating pupils. So if we send much light at 480 nanometers, we will then stimulate the pupils. So we are in the 80s. Spectacles had been launched to protect wearers from sunlight and get tanned at the same time. Just dresses with larger shoulder padding. Now they are out of fashion, but with those sun spectacles, sunglasses, you would filter invisible light, letting UV light in. The side effects of these sunglasses were opening the door to light reaching the retina without the natural protection that our eyes otherwise have. You cannot generalize when talking about exposure to light. There are different types of light sources, and depending on the source, features. We will have light reaching the retina. If we are talking about a concentration from a small point-shaped source, we will have, on the contrary, other types of sources with a different effect. So consider the lens in the eyes, for instance. If I have to fix a LED with UV light, the effect will be rather perceived at retinal level. How can we protect our eyes? Well, first of all, we should rule out what harms the eyes. Let's pause during the announcement. At the end, there will be a Q&A session to Zeiss and Hoya. I've got one question myself to ask you. So we were talking about protection of the eyes. We need to filter off harmful light. We have two ways to do that. We can reflect light, or we can place a polymer in between absorbing the light. So we have transmittance, the last formula you have in this slide. There are some mathematical formulas here in these slides. Looks easy. The difficult ones will be proposed later. Transmittance, so here you see the light absorption out of the overall quantity of light reaches a body. When dealing with the transmittance, we have a chart like this one. This is the ID of a specific filter, of a specific protection product. We see how much a product can absorb or reflect depending on the surface treatment at each wavelength. Transmittance of UV light is the synthesis of the result of this simple formula, enabling us to obtain a percentage, i.e. the quantity of light which really reaches the eyes. Here you see also our eyes behave like filters. They filter off something and let other light in. They act as filters so that we can perceive colors, and this also applies to blue, a color that we can see, despite the fact that this light source is in the lower part of this chart where we have energy-rich light. There are different absorption values. So the quantity of energy of light which is trapped. This is a picture published in a book in the 80s by Lerman. Here you see the photochromatism of the lens, which is non-reversible. This is the color change over the years of our lenses. So if we see brown lenses, it means that the lenses have absorbed everything which is below brown, so low wavelengths, and lenses can become fluorescent. If you see here, we have short wavelengths, blue or ultraviolet light. Here you see a fluorescent lens, hence a reduction in contrast and poorer quality of image. You see how lenses change with the age. So as you get older, your lenses protect the layers behind them, i.e. the retina. When we are younger, we have very transparent lenses. So we are exposed to light, and there can be low wavelength light which can reach the retina. And here we open to prevention. Here you see a common bias. So there is nobody's land in the middle, an area between visible light and UV light. Making reference to ISO standards, the bar for UV light is 380 nanometers. The SIE, another prestigious body, on the contrary, sets the bar at 400. There are 20 nanometers in between these two values. 20 nanometers might of very energy-rich light. We are approaching to the light which is close to blue, so light which can reach the retina. Energy-rich light, blue-violet light, as we might call it. And here we need more clarity. We also need more clarity in this is ISO standard 8980 with the classification of the various filters and their absorption patterns. Here you see darker filters and UV protection. If we take, for instance, clear lenses, ISO standards do not pose any specific requirement for UV protection because transmittance in UVA is the same transmittance as for visible light. So the quantity of UV light which reaches the Earth's surface, UVA, for light lenses are not regarded as significant. So they just let the light in. Look at this pie chart with the volumes. We can discuss about it with Silvana and Fabio later. As you see, the ophthalmological lens market can be broken down into high protection 30% and low protection 70%. We analyze products and 70% are CR39, so no adequate protection from UV light. 30% of these products contain high index polymers recommended by professionals because they also have a better appearance. The internal value, the embedded value, also covers UV light. For contact lenses, we are slightly better off. As you see, ISO standards here apply otherwise. Contact lenses with UV contact filter are subdivided into two classes. We have one class with higher absorption and a second class with lower absorption. We are here referring to transparent contact lenses. And then, of course, considering what comes from behind, there might be something which has been left open for light to get in. We might have very roping, very round-shaped frames, but if we move away from the main plane, we can have apparent or effective protection in the anterior area, but we won't have any effective protection in the posterior area. There are numerical values and parameters which have been proposed, but you also have to consider the finished sunglasses. Let me just refer to this message to close with. When you select a UV protection, you consider your phenotype, your skin type, and depending on that, different UV protections are recommended. This does not apply to UV lenses. We should learn to do that. There are some categories of wearers who are more at risk. We are talking about individuals with cataract. Filtering of UV light also allows them to see better, or photosensitizing drugs, or people who are very exposed to UV light because of their profession. We have an overexposure to UV light. Then there are also individuals who already have pinguicular or macular degeneration because they haven't been using protection. And most of all, children. The earlier you start, the better. We have the blue light effect and myopic progression, which could also be explored for further research. So if we want to communicate, these are the messages we should focus on when we propose UV lenses to our customers. So UV protection has still got a role to play. The products we have also enable us to make a real difference for our patients.
Una domandina veloce.
Very brief question to you as well, Giancarlo, as you are a professor, but you are a man in the field. What would you suggest the youth and those that have been working for so many years in the optical world well, it's a key word. We shall go back to next session. And our subject with visual problems should be at the center of our attention. We should have personalized prescriptions. And today it's important and assign certain characteristics to lifestyles and visual requirements, and the optician makes available specific products for every need. In my opinion, the key word is personalization, customization. Thanks a lot. That's my idea when I say that optics is a science, but the optician should transform it into an art. I'd like to give the floor to our friends from Zeiss and Hoya. We can ask questions. And the industry, ophthalmics, has made available so much to the optometrical medical world in terms of solutions. Why are we tackling Why are you tackling with the UV theme and problem, Briganti? First of all, thank you so much, Fabiano, for the opportunity to speak here about UV. To give an answer to the question, basically, the right word is responsibility. We as companies are responsible to take care of the eyes of our subjects. That's the basic message I would like to communicate to all people present here, because very often the concept of protection was basically replaced with the concept of aesthetics. Well, protection has been forgotten by the market. That's our main responsibility. Now, Silvano, Larker, Hoya, yes, companies should keep on investing in research so that ophthalmologists and opticians can have more and more sophisticated products. And I agree with Giancarlo and what he said before. The final choice is always in the hands of those prescribing eyeglasses. You should have a 360-degree view. Best corrective refraction and protection. We can provide support that then ophthalmologists and optometrists can prescribe. Somebody from the floor, questions for our panelists and technical representatives from the companies? So, yes. After what? I'm sorry, I wear photochromatic glasses because I'm extremely scared now after such speeches. Other questions? No. I have a question for Fabio and Silvano. A previous slide shown by Giancarlo stated that 2/3 of lenses sold have minimum UV protection. The question is why? I know it's not an easy question. More simple motivation, that famous 7% of awareness. Those buying eyeglasses, awareness about UV damage, and also the culture of the mother saying whatever is black provides protection. You've worn black eyeglasses, sunglasses CR39, well, they shouldn't necessarily have UV protection 100%. Very often they don't have it. And this point was raised last year when we spoke about blue light, and sunglasses don't offer complete protection, so you should also ask to have UV protection. And Briganti, when you drive a car, how could you behave better? That's another important aspect. Windscreen of cars absorb UV. And side mirrors instead don't have any type of protection. So UV protection is suggested to those spending a lot of time in a car, or to have also side protection. And the effects of photo aging of the skin are effects that can be seen in the course of time, and not just in the first 2-3 days of work. You have people spending 25-30 years of work in a car, in a truck. At this point, there's a question. On the right, if somebody helps me with the mic. If you can please stand up. Alberto Villa, I'd like to know if there's a relationship between polarized lenses and UV protection. Polarized lenses today protect more than non-polarized lenses. Well, usually all photochromatic lenses already have a UV protection, 400 nanometers. Colored lenses, no, because it depends on the color. Usually in Italy, the color in high demand is gray. Absorption is 75-80%, and this color cannot guarantee complete UV protection. Not getting to Australian standards, but not even ISO standards. It's above 380 nanometers, and all polarizing lenses, irrespective of their color, they start from protection that gets to 400 nanometers. Is there another question on the left? One of our young friends, if you can help me give the traveling mic. Your name? Fabio. Are you a student? Third year. Do you study well? Good marks? Yes. Enough. You can ask the question. Can an anti-reflective common lens protect against UV rays? Who wants to answer? Silvano. No. Usually, anti-reflective lenses and protection should always be quantified at a technical level. However, anti-reflective lenses don't protect against UV. The material frontally can absorb something. There are anti-reflective lenses that increase protection internal surface, but for example, You should also assess the type of frame. If I have a wrapping, enveloping frame, you don't need internal protection. But anti-reflective lenses by themselves can reduce internally, but frontally they don't do much. Okay. To close this interesting panel with high distinguished speakers, I have a feeling when I switch on my iPhone and I use my thumb, I always ask myself a question. We humans are so different one from the other. The concept of giving everybody everything is impossible, and each eye is different than the other. Each situation is different. So such novelties are extremely welcome. We need tailor-made solutions for clients. Thanks a lot, everybody. Please stay here at the table. We shall have another interesting round table on blue light. I'd like to thank Mr. Scalinci, the ophthalmologist, who shall leave us. And thanks a lot, everybody. Blue light.
Fra 2 minuti.
In 2 minutes.